Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain in 1940, was doomed from the start because Germany lacked naval strength. Hitler had only 43 operational U-boats at the time, far too few to challenge Britain's control of the seas, backed by roughly 1,400 ships. Had he started building them the moment he came to power in 1933, Germany could have had over 400 by 1939, enough to potentially cut off Britain's economy early in the war. Hitler didn't see this need because he assumed Britain, as another Anglo-Saxon nation, would not fight Germany. His racial ideology blinded him to Britain's long rivalry with Germany and to Churchill's determination. This misplaced belief led him to neglect naval planning, prioritizing land conquests and ideology instead of preparing for Britain's resistance. Despite his own World War I experience fighting British regiments, Hitler failed to appreciate the threat Britain posed at sea. The weak navy meant a direct invasion was impossible, forcing Hitler to rely on the Luftwaffe instead. The Battle of Britain. By mid-1940, Germany could not launch Operation Sea Lion because it lacked both naval power and air superiority. The German Air Force began attacking Britain in July, striking ports, shipping convoys, and later Royal Air Force airfields, hoping to cripple fighter command. Factories and infrastructure were also targeted, with Hermann Göring believing that attacks by the Luftwaffe alone could bring Britain to its knees. A turning point came after a lost German bomber accidentally struck London on August 25th. Churchill ordered retaliation on Berlin the next night, despite the RAF's weakened state, which enraged Hitler. He shifted the Luftwaffe's focus from RAF bases to London itself, trying to knock out the British docks, giving Britain time to repair airfields and regroup. Hitler's emotional decision to bomb London, rather than maintain pressure on the Royal Air Force, meant a turning point. Radar and the resilience of Spitfire and Hurricane squadrons allowed Britain to blunt German attacks. The decisive moment came on September 15th, when RAF fighters destroyed large numbers of German bombers left exposed as Messerschmitt escorts ran low on fuel. With mounting losses and the RAF still intact, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. It was never put into action. The SS even had prepared a black book, listing 2,820 prominent Britons, including absurd entries like the deceased Sigmund Freud, to be arrested after invading. After the Luftwaffe's defeat, this plan became a symbol of Germany's overconfidence. The Battle of Britain became Germany's first major defeat in the war. Operation Barbarossa, launched in June 1941, was the largest invasion in history, with over 3 million men attacking the Soviet Union. Hitler's motives were ideological as much as strategic. The quest for Lebensraum, living space in the East, the destruction of Bolshevism and the elimination of Jews in Soviet territory. The Germans assumed the communists were weak and expected the USSR to collapse within months. The opening weeks brought successes. Luftwaffe strikes destroyed 25% of Soviet aircraft on the first day, and huge encirclement battles wiped out hundreds of thousands of Red Army troops. But pauses to eliminate isolated Soviet troops slowed the advance, giving the Soviets time to reorganize and bring in reinforcements. Over 5 million men by late 1941. German forces also underestimated the sheer size of the Red Army, the vastness of the land, and the difficulty of keeping their own troops supplied across enormous distances. Logistics quickly became a nightmare. Trucks broke down or consumed too much fuel. Trains were incompatible with Soviet tracks, and Soviet scorched earth tactics destroyed railways and depots. By August, army groups north and center had lost a large share of their vehicles. Meanwhile, the Soviets relocated their industry, ramped up production of weapons like the T-34 tank, and received massive aid from the Allies in trucks, tanks, and food. As the German offensive closed in on Moscow, worsening weather, exhaustion, and supply shortages halted the advance. Without proper winter clothing, German soldiers were exposed to the brutal cold, which caused mass frostbite and deaths. Hitler's belief that sheer willpower could overcome these conditions only compounded the suffering. On December 6th, the Red Army launched a surprise counter-offensive, driving the Germans back. Barbarossa's failure weakened Germany, contributing to later defeats in campaigns like Case Blue and Citadel. Hitler's refusal to take advice from his own generals was a major factor in Germany's defeat. Commanders like Rommel, Guderian, and von Manstein were skilled strategists. Yet Hitler rarely acted on their recommendations. He often let them speak for hours, then simply followed his original plan. German generals were also frequently moved around, dismissed, and even reappointed, creating instability in the chain of command and confusion. Hitler's habit of constantly changing his mind, such as with jet aircraft production, caused industrial delays and wasted resources. More damaging was his ideological rejection of strategic withdrawals. Hitler believed retreat would look like weakness to the German people, though the army could conduct effective pullbacks and counterattacks, as seen in Manstein's Kharkov offensive. Instead, he ordered troops to hold ground at all costs, resulting in encirclements and massive losses like Stalingrad that might otherwise have been avoided. The wrong generals. As the war dragged on, Hitler increasingly appointed generals based on loyalty to Nazism rather than military skill. Figures like Ferdinand Schörner, Lothar Rendulic, and Hans Krebs were politically reliable but not of the same caliber as Germany's best field commanders. Schörner, a fanatical Nazi, prioritized brutal discipline over strategy. Rendulic showed some competence in defensive battles, and Krebs was a capable staff officer, but they lacked the strategic skills of sidelined leaders such as Guderian or Manstein. The problem was even more visible with high-profile appointments. Hermann Göring, despite his political weight, oversaw the Luftwaffe's decline through poor leadership, notably failing to supply Stalingrad's trapped 6th Army via airlifts, costing thousands of lives. While Himmler placed loyal Nazi supporters in command positions within the Waffen-SS. These choices reflected Hitler's preference for ideological commitment over military effectiveness. By elevating loyalists and discarding independent thinkers, Hitler deprived the German army of its most innovative leadership at the very moment it needed adaptability. The declaration of war on the US. On December 11, 1941, just days after Pearl Harbor, Hitler declared war on the United States, a move widely seen as one of his biggest mistakes. Again, the decision was driven more by ideology than strategy. Hitler assumed the US would focus on Japan and that it lacked the strength to challenge Germany in Europe. Instead, Washington adopted a Germany first policy, committing its vast resources to Europe before the Pacific. Hitler's low opinion of America reflected his racial worldview. He dismissed the US as run by Jews and blacks, culturally inferior and militarily weak, believing it could not field serious armies. However, America quickly deployed large forces, with 250,000 troops landing in North Africa by late 1942 and later invading Sicily and France. German leaders underestimated American industry as well. By 1944, the US produced 96,000 aircraft, far outpacing Germany. Some German officials, like Albert Speer, understood that American entry doomed the war effort, but Hitler ignored such warnings. Declaring war on the United States added a superpower enemy at the very moment Germany was stalled in Russia. The Holocaust, while central to Hitler's ideology, was a major strategic blunder. By persecuting Jews, the regime destroyed a vast pool of intelligent, skilled and educated people who could have supported Germany's war effort. The Holocaust, alongside war losses, reduced Germany's labor force from 39 million in 1939 to 29 million by 1945, weakening industrial output. Nazi persecution also drove many of Germany's leading scientists and intellectuals into exile, and those who fled contributed directly to Allied advances, notably the Manhattan Project's atomic bomb. The intellectual loss was stark. Before 1933, Germany had produced far more Nobel laureates in physics and chemistry than the US, but after the Nazi purge, America surged ahead while German innovation stagnated. Moreover, many trains were used for deportations instead of troop movements. Hitler's obsession with racial ideology over rational strategy ultimately strengthened his enemies and weakened his own war effort. Germany's economic mismanagement was another key reason for defeat. Despite fighting a global war, Hitler did not fully mobilize the economy until 1943, when Albert Speer took charge of production. By then, it was far too late to compete with Allied industry. Shortages of oil, steel and other resources crippled the German war machine, especially on the Eastern Front. Germany's reliance on plundered resources from occupied territories became unsustainable as resistance grew. Hitler's priorities made matters worse. Instead of focusing on efficient mass production, he wasted resources on prestige projects like the V weapons and advanced prototypes that could not be built in sufficient numbers. Meanwhile, Allied economies operated at full capacity from early on. By 1945, the US had built nearly 300,000 aircraft across the war, dwarfing Germany's output. Germany, no matter how effective its armies were in battle, could never match the material power of its enemies. Allied intelligence played a decisive role in Germany's defeat. The breaking of Enigma and Lorenz codes at Bletchley Park gave the Allies direct insight into German operations, from U-boat movements in the Atlantic to troop deployments on land. This advantage allowed convoys to avoid submarine wolf packs, drastically reducing shipping losses. The Ultra program, for example, aided precise planning for D-Day, disrupting German defenses. But Hitler assumed German ciphers were unbreakable, and again underestimated the scale of Allied intelligence success. German communications continued to be intercepted, allowing the Allies to anticipate and counter key strategies. In the Battle of the Atlantic especially, code-breaking shifted the balance, ensuring Britain's survival and securing vital supply lines. Hitler left Germany exposed to an invisible enemy that repeatedly disrupted his campaigns. Hitler's failure in diplomacy left Germany without strong or coordinated allies. Italy proved more of a burden than a partner, with military failures in Greece and North Africa forcing Germany to divert men and resources. Japan, on the other side, refused to attack the Soviet Union in 1941, allowing Stalin to concentrate on the Eastern Front instead of fighting a two-front war. Although Japan had joined the Anti-Comintern Pact in 1937, cooperation remained minimal. Germany and Japan fought separate wars, shared little technology, and failed to coordinate strategy. No joint offensives against the USSR or pressure on British positions in the Indian Ocean. Hitler's arrogance and racial ideology also prevented him from winning over neutral nations like Turkey or Spain, which could have strengthened Axis positions. In contrast, the Allies' Big Three conferences, like Tehran or Yalta, kept Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union united around a common plan. The Axis powers, divided and mistrustful, were never able to match that level of cooperation. Nazi occupation policies turned potential allies into enemies. In places like Ukraine, millions had a strong dislike for the Bolsheviks in Moscow, having suffered greatly during the deliberate starvation of 2 to 7 million Ukrainians in the Great Famines of the 1920s and early 30s. They initially saw the Germans as liberators, and Hitler had a chance to win local support against the Soviet Union. Instead, his racial ideology prevented any genuine offer of autonomy. Ukrainians, Poles, and other occupied peoples were treated with brutality, driving them into resistance movements. Rather than gaining allies, Germany created enemies behind its own front lines. Partisan warfare disrupted supply routes and tied down German troops, amplifying Soviet successes like Operation Bagration, which devastated Germany's Eastern Front. Hitler's inability to separate ideology from strategy meant he sacrificed valuable opportunities to weaken the USSR by refusing to work with populations that shared a hatred of Moscow. By fueling resistance instead of partnership, Nazi policies stretched German forces thin and turned occupied territories into yet another front Germany could not control.